Okay guys, so welcome to the second session on Plato. Let me make sure the volume's up. Okay, perfect. So now the approach is going to, I'm going to attempt to minimize the amount of lecturing to give you a chance to actually read through the text as we're discussing it, as you know, as this lecture proceeds. And the good thing, right, is that this text is relatively straightforward, right, and there's a lot of resources about it. The challenge is not so much understanding the text, but kind of appreciating the context and as I was saying earlier, why exactly it is relevant. And one of the obstacles of doing so is that when we think about politics and when we think about politics and philosophy, we generally tend to think of them as being two mutually exclusive things, right? And it's also somewhat difficult to appreciate Plato's critique of democracy and the way he tries to understand justice and whatnot. But this is something that we will get through, inshallah, throughout the talks, right? Throughout these videos. So on Tuesday, I believe, or on Wednesday, we gave a brief introduction, okay? And to recap, basically all we said was that in order to appreciate the text, we have to understand that for the Greeks, especially for Plato, philosophy and politics were not two mutually different subjects or categories, right? That any political state, as we will see next week, must be and is inevitably grounded in a particular philosophy. It assumes a certain philosophy. It has certain assumptions about what is the nature of man, what is the good, what is the structure of reality, remember metaphysics, and so forth, right? And Plato essentially wants to introduce a political state that is grounded in a true philosophy, right? That is grounded in justice. And this is difficult for us to dispute, right? This idea that a state ought to be grounded in justice and that we ought to live in light of what we deem to be good. The objection that we might have is, well, how is that even practical, right? Because there are different conceptions of justice, there are different ideas as to what is good and what is not good, and how do we prevent despotism or the state in which one particular politician, for example, tries to enforce his or her own definition of what it means to be good, right? And then the inevitable question, which is being raised in this chapter, right, in this book, in this particular book, within Plato's Republic, is that does the concept of justice really even exist in its own right, right? Is it something tangible or something that can be discovered, right? Or is it just a slogan, right? And for for students living in Lebanon or being familiar with Lebanese politics, we this is something that we've pretty much lived, right? So we can kind of understand it because we have experienced it, right? The use of political slogans and political oppositions and the rhetoric that conceals political interests and so forth. So the immediate response to Plato's suggestion, which in this text is being personified by Socrates, is that, look, there is a concrete, by concrete I don't mean physical, but there is a conception of justice, right? Justice is real. And for Adiamantus and Glaucon, right, who are average citizens, young citizens of the Athenian Republic, of the Athenian democracy, their response is, that sounds good in theory, but you have to prove it to us. Now, why is this important, right? Kind of to put this in context, right? we gave an example and we said, let's suppose that we were in a committee and that we had to form a government for Lebanon. And really the whole idea for Beirut, and really the whole idea of trying to form a government or trying to change things or revolution, right, would be somewhat meaningless if we were to concede to the idea maybe that, well, there's no such thing as justice, right? At the end of the day, it's only about one person imposing their own conception of the good. So Glaucon and Adiamantus, as we would be, are open to the suggestion. And so we engage in this debate with Socrates, or like I said, on Wednesday, Plato comes into the committee and he proposes this idea. So what exactly is happening in this particular reading with Glaucon and Adiamantus on one hand and Socrates on another? Now, this is what we call a form of Socratic dialogue. Okay. And the purpose of a Socratic dialogue is to kind of have this back and forth, okay, between two different ideas. And the objective of Socrates in this case, right, the character, or of course the actual author Plato, is to kind of is to bring out through the opponent that he is speaking to the contradictions in his or her position, right? To try to make the reader reach certain conclusions without explicitly stating them as a thesis, right? So there's this back and forth, okay, which is actually very helpful. And the purpose of it, again, is not to tell us what to think, but to make us aware about certain contradictions which we might have in our position. So let's begin with the first dialogue that is occurring between Socrates and between Adiamantus and Glaucon. So the context is that they are in the city of Athens, and Socrates is proposing a new form of governance. And the existing mode of governance at that time is a democracy. Okay, and for Plato, a democracy is essentially a dysfunctional mode of governance. Okay, why is the dysfunctional mode of governance, right? So in this text and in other texts, Plato points out that the problem with democracy is that the masses are unqualified to try to articulate certain political positions, right? Or to try to think about what ought to be the vision for the city-state, for the nation, and so forth. And they are unqualified because they are untrained to do so on one hand. And on the other hand, they have their own personal interests. Every individual has his or her own personal interests and desires, and they can be influenced by corrupt politicians through rhetoric, right? So the reality is, for Plato, that there is no real majority that is conscientious and wise and goodwill, right? Instead, we have competing interests, one of which, the majority, prevails over the others, right? And what democracy does for Plato is that it displaces the question of, well, what is good? What is justice, right? And if justice is real and it is something that is objective, then it stands correct, right? And it stands primary to individual or to majority opinions. So if a majority were to argue that we ought to, for example, wipe out a certain minority, or that we ought to distribute wealth in according to merit, for example, right? This is for Plato an opinion, right? It bears nothing on whether or not justice is actually distribution according to merit, or that it is moral, for example, or just to take out a certain minority, right? It exists objectively. In the same way, if I were to say that the sky is blue, this is an objective opinion that is true independently of someone else's opinion, even if that someone else were a majority. So the first question to be posed, right, if we want to get to the core of the issue is, well, what is justice? Well, to ask what is justice, we have to ask, does justice exist? Is it something that is real? So this is the debate that takes place in the beginning, and this is what we will go through, right? So Glaucon and Adiamentus pose the following question to Socrates, right, Plato. Is justice even worth pursuing? Right? Is it even real? Is it something concrete and tangible? Right? Let's start with the fundamental, says Glaucon. Is justice even real? Right? Which is the bedrock of your argument, Mr. Socrates. So Glaucon says, look, there are three types of good. If we agree that justice is some kind of good, let's classify goods as three different types. There are things that are good in and of themselves, right? Meaning that their goodness stands on its own and it requires nothing to justify it. Okay? There are things that are good only in a secondary sense, meaning that the good in this case, let's say, for example, being honest, right, is good only insofar as it allows us to achieve something that is good in and of itself, right, and certain ends. So, for example, is it good to be honest, or are we honest because it helps us secure good jobs, or because it makes us look good, right? And then the third possibility is that there are things that are good in and of themselves, and they produce good things as well. So before we use the example of honesty, of justice, so for example, is being honest good in and of itself? Meaning I should do it independently of what the consequences might be, or there's nothing else to justify. I am good because being good is a good in and of itself, right? Am I good? Am I honest because it again allows me to appear good, right? It allows me to have a good reputation, and this will increase my wealth and my status in society. Or am I honest, for example, because it is good in and of itself, and it will lead to a good life. It will allow me to secure true happiness. So the same thing can be said about justice. Now, Glaucon points out, he says, look, Socrates, the prevailing opinion, whether it's correct or incorrect, is that when we think of justice, we think of it in the second sense. Okay? Generally, in a democracy, we are we are just because it allows us to secure something else. Okay. So he gives an example. He says, when people are good in this Athenian democracy, right? Are they good? When they are just, are they just because they fear the repercussions of being unjust? Or are they just because it is a good in and of itself? Yani, what prevents me from stealing my neighbor's television? Is it a sense of justice? Or is it because I am afraid that if I do so, I am then liable to being robbed myself? Is it because I am afraid of the law? If that were the case, then justice is not a good in and of itself. Justice is merely something that I do to secure my safety, for example. And the only reason that we are not unjust is quite simply because we do not have the power to do so. We are not powerful enough. So, in other words, if I was the head of a gang, for example, and I had the power and the capacity without fear to rob my neighbor's television, I would probably do it, according to Glaucon, right? So the only thing that's stopping me from being just is really fear or the lack of power. So because we lack power, Glaucon says, and that we have fear, we create pacts, right, that we call a political association or law, and we come up with this idea of justice, just so that, we agree not to steal from one another, and then we give it a fancy name, right? Justice or being ethical and so forth. Now, he gives another interesting, throughout the text, he gives another very interesting story, another interesting example. And that is the story of the Ring of Gyges. Now, the idea of the Ring of Gyges is basically an invisibility ring, a ring that if you were put on, you would become invisible. So Glaucon puts forth a very powerful argument to Socrates. And notice how, the part of Plato's strength is in Greek philosophy is that yes, they deal with ideals, right, and thoughts and whatnot, but they also work from life upwards, right? That's part of the beauty of the Socratic dialogue, that they use concrete examples, right? So imagine you have this ring, Glaucon says, and when you put it on, you become invisible. طيب, very nice. What would you do if you had this ring, right? What would the average person do if he had this ring? Knowing that there are no repercussions, knowing that there is no punishment, and so forth. So Glaucon says, well, if I had this ring, right, or if people had this ring, naturally they would be disposed towards tyranny and towards being unjust. So Socrates, Glaucon concludes, tell us, what is this justice that you are speaking about? Where does it come in play? Right? Why is it worth us even pursuing if in this concrete world that you are trying to think about and philosophize about, right, justice doesn't really even exist? Now, let me point out something here before I proceed, okay? There are two Platonic responses, two ways that Plato responds to this. And we have to, and this is, I think, the only really somewhat complicated point, okay, that I will try to make here. There are two answers to this question. There are two questions really being asked. The first is, why should humans be just? And can they be just? Why, right? This is a practical, concrete question. And to put this in other words, will justice make me happy? Will being just make me happy? Right? This is the question that the average citizen would ask, like Glaucon at Alimentus. But there's another question which stands independently of whether we should or we should not be just, or so whether it will make us happy or not happy, which is going back to the initial question that we asked: does justice even exist? And if it does exist, where does it exist? Right? So if we think of society as merely being a group of individuals and that their decisions are driven by personal interests and where do our ideas come from? I don't know, they come from our material instinctual impulses, and that the cosmos is really what is the cosmos? The cosmos is a bunch of competing self-interested, arrogant gods who who intervene and have human emotions, it would be difficult to say that an idea of justice exists, right? Where does it exist, right? Okay. Now, Plato, right, in addition to having written the Republic, is also famous for another philosophical contribution, which is actually at the core of this book, which is that unlike the world of Homer, and unlike the world of Oedipus, Sophocles, right, uh, uh, the world, reality, is actually constituted by three realms, three levels of reality. In the same way, for example, with the Abrahamic faith, in Christianity, for example, one would say that there is the heavens, right? The heavenly bodies, right? There is earth, which is the fallen state of man, and then there is God. So for Plato, you have, he doesn't really address this, but the divine intellect, or the one, the Plotinus, right? The idea of the one and whatnot. We can discuss that later. And then you have what he calls the world of ideas, the realm of ideas. So this is basically a more real realm that exists, right? And in it, you have the perfect forms. For example, you have, just to give you a metaphoric example, you have the perfect triangle. When we see triangles in our material world, these are just shadows. These are deformed reflections of the perfect triangle. So similarly, you have justice, right? You have a real ideal that is called justice. And so in the material world, what do we try to do? We try to approximate or reach the idea of justice, to know it, in the same way, for example, a mathematician attempts to draw a perfect triangle. He attempts to approximate it, though he can never exactly do it. So Plato has already laid out this philosophy that that justice does exist in the objective sense, and that justice is even more real than the opinions that we produce in this world about it, or about anything related to ethics, because this world is merely a reflection, it is merely a set of shadows of that which is more real, right? So light is more real than the shadows that it produces. So Plato, and this is gouged in Plato's famous metaphor of the cave. So we'll talk about the realm of ideas and Plato's philosophy in the next video. But it's just important to make that distinction, okay? That distinction between the question of, does justice even exist, right? Is it something that we can even speak of? And the second question that Socrates is having with the citizens, not with the philosophers, with the citizens of Athens. And he's trying to make the argument that not only does justice exist, right, objectively exist, but that it will also make you happy, right? It is not only, so what he will argue is that not only Socrates, not only is it something that is good in and of itself, well, because it exists, right? And it is the ideal, yeah? But it will also produce other good things as well. It will also allow you to secure true happiness. So to avoid confusion, let me kind of jump ahead, okay? And try to tell you what exactly is Socrates about to argue, right? Just so kind of you have like a mental map, right, of where we are going. So Socrates will argue, he will be like, look, not only does justice exist objectively, right? It is something that we can aspire towards. In other words, it's not a social construct, right? Not only does it exist, but I am going to make a let's say, pragmatic argument for it. It is also something that is good in and of itself, that you should aspire to it, and it secures true happiness. What is true happiness? He says there are two types of happiness. The first is an illusion. It is merely a satisfaction of one's instinctual desires, right? Like eating and drinking and so forth, right? But there is another type of happiness, which is the happiness of tranquility and contentment, which comes only when you live in accordance with the truth. Why? Because he will point out that man is not only a being with instinctual desires, but he also has an intellect, right? And that only justice will conform to both his instinctual desires and his intellect, right? Otherwise, he is living in an illusion. So, okay. It's my sister. I come into the room to try to avoid noise, and she's here. 1 second. I'm gonna pause. This is Aya. She also took CVSP and did AUB and
Hi guys. Where are they?
This is recorded.
Oh, I hope everybody's doing well.
Yeah. So, okay. Anyways, let's get back to the discussion on Glaucon and Adiamantus and Socrates. But before that, let me summarize what we have said so far. So far, we have said this. Socrates is, Plato is trying to argue that we ought to adopt a new form of government and replace democracy. Adiamantus and Glaucon are posing a few challenges, and they say this state that is based on justice, as you claim, it sounds a bit theoretical. So convince us. And to convince us, you have to prove to us that justice is something that is worth pursuing. And to convince us that is worth pursuing, you must convince us that is something that is good in and of itself, and not something that we merely do to secure some kind of other end, such as reputation, honor, safety, wealth, fame, and so forth. So Plato, using the character of Socrates, says, I will do something better than that. I will prove to you that justice is a good in and of itself, and it is good and that it produces true happiness. Now, this is going to lead Socrates, and this is going to lead the discussion in new directions, because now Socrates must redefine what does it mean to be human, right? Because he's saying that true happiness comes through justice, and that man is not merely satisfied and does not attain justice purely through his desires and fame and all that stuff. So now the discussion is beginning to branch out, right? It's becoming richer. It is delving deeper into philosophy, right? So we have so now Adiamantus says, okay, Glaucon says, okay, you're talking to us about happiness and that we will be more happy if we are just and so forth. That sounds nice, again, in theory, right? But let me put forth a test. Let me put forth a hypothetical problem for you, Socrates, in the same way I gave you the hypothetical problem of the ring of Gyges. That hypothetical test is as follows. Suppose you have two different individuals, person A and person B. So person A is a just person, but he has the reputation for being unjust. Person B is unjust, but has the reputation of being just. Now, we can kind of see where this is going. Reputation is everything, right? For us, at least. Reputation is what other people think of us, what other people call us. Our securing of a job depends on reputation, wastat depend on reputation, and so forth. So the question that Adiamantis is posing is this: will person A be truly happier than person B, despite having the reputation for being unjust? But he is in fact just. In other words, can person A be happy independently of having the reputation of being unjust and the consequences that will come as a result of that? طيب. Now, I'm going to leave it at that so that you guys can begin thinking about this particular problem and how Socrates might respond to it, keeping in mind what we have read so far. Okay, keeping in mind what I have told you about philosophy's theory of ideals and Plato's and Socrates' attempt to redefine human nature in order to properly adequately answer this question. Okay, so make sure you've read the first two readings in the text, which I believe are, well, actually, I mean, you have the section on justice in state and individual, and yeah, so this is a good 32 pages. You have to make sure that you have read this, so that we can go beyond the definition of justice and begin basically talking about how a state, how the Platonic Republic really looks like, and so forth. But please make sure that you have read, I believe it's book 5. Yes, sorry, book 4. Please make sure that you have read book 4 so that we can proceed, inshallah, and begin talking about more concrete issues. Okay, see you guys on Tuesday.